The first time my mother announced it, it wasn't in private, and it wasn't gentle, and it definitely wasn't accidental. It happened at a long oak table in a crowded restaurant where the clink of glasses and low laughter made it impossible for me to react without becoming a spectacle, and she smiled in that practiced way she always used when she was about to hurt me while pretending it was kindness, leaned slightly forward, and said clearly enough for everyone on both sides of the table to hear that they had decided to pass the cottage. His parents gave me over to my brother instead, because it just made more sense that way. And for a few seconds I couldn't tell if the sudden ringing in my ears was from the noise of the room or the realization that something deeply personal had just been stripped from me in public without warning, discussion, or even the decency of a private conversation. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, my husband's hand tightened under the table, and my brother let out a short laugh that sounded more like relief than surprise, which told me immediately that this wasn't a new idea they'd just come up with over appetizers, but something already decided, already justified, already rehearsed, and the humiliation hit before the anger because that's how it always went with my family, the pain first and the understanding later, and I remember noticing absurd details in that moment, like the way the server paused behind my mother as if sensing something was wrong, or how the candle between us flickered when my father cleared his throat and nodded as if this were a minor logistical update rather than a declaration that the last thing that truly felt like it belonged to me no longer did. I wanted to ask what she meant, to point out that the cottage wasn't theirs to pass around like a serving dish, that it had been given to me by my husband's parents years ago, after we married, when they downsized and told us they wanted us to have a place that felt like stability and rest. But the words tangled in my chest because this wasn't just about a cottage, it never was. It was about a pattern that had followed me since childhood, one where decisions about my life were made around me, never with me, and always in ways that benefited my younger brother while being framed as reasonable, inevitable, or for the good of the family. My mother kept talking, filling the silence I couldn't break, explaining how my brother needed it more right now, how he and his girlfriend were thinking about starting a family, how I was already settled, how it would be selfish of me to cling to something I wasn't even using full-time, each sentence landing like a quiet accusation, and I could feel the familiar pressure building, the unspoken expectation that I would nod, smile, and absorb the loss gracefully so no one else would feel uncomfortable, because that was the role I'd been trained for since I was a daughter who didn't need as much, didn't ask for much, and therefore could always give more. My father avoided my eyes, focusing on his plate the way he always did when my mother took control, and my brother leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no, not when we were kids and not now. And the worst part wasn't even the announcement itself but the way it rewrote reality in front of witnesses, turning something that belonged to me into something I was expected to surrender without protest. And as the conversation moved on to dessert and weekend plans, I sat there shrinking into myself, acutely aware that if I spoke up, I would become the problem, the difficult daughter, the one who couldn't just let things go. And that fear, planted early and watered often, kept my mouth shut even as a lifetime of smaller moments lined up behind this one. Memories of graduations where my achievements were overshadowed by my brother's average milestones. Family dinners where my concerns were brushed aside while his complaints became emergencies. Financial help that somehow always flowed in one direction, and I realized, sitting there under soft restaurant lighting with strangers laughing around us, that this wasn't a misunderstanding to be corrected but a declaration of hierarchy being enforced, a reminder of where I stood and where I was expected to remain. And while everyone else tasted wine and sweetness, I swallowed humiliation and told myself, as I had so many times before, that making a scene would only make things worse, that I could deal with it later, that staying calm was strength, not knowing yet that this moment, quiet and controlled on the surface, was the point where something in me finally stopped trying to earn fairness from people who had never intended to give it. After that dinner, the story my family told themselves hardened quickly into something fixed and unquestionable, and by the time we left the restaurant and stepped into the cool night air, it was already being treated as settled fact rather than a decision made about my life without my consent. And what hurt most in the days that followed wasn't just the loss of the cottage itself but the speed with which my role was rewritten to accommodate everyone else's comfort. Because when I tried, carefully, to revisit the topic with my mother a few days later, she responded not with surprise or reconsideration but with irritation, as if I were bringing up something inconvenient and unnecessary, reminding me that families had to make sacrifices and that I, as the older daughter who had always managed, was simply better equipped to handle disappointment. A phrase she'd used so many times throughout my life that it felt almost affectionate to her even as it hollowed me out. Growing up, this logic had been applied to everything, from the way my brother's sports schedules dictated our weekends while my academic events were attended only if they didn't conflict, to the way my college acceptance was framed as expected while his barely passing grades were celebrated as proof of effort. And I learned early that excellence bought me responsibility, not recognition, that being capable meant being convenient, and that any discomfort I felt was something to be processed privately. So the family equilibrium remained undisturbed. At my high school graduation, I remember scanning the crowd for my parents and spotting them easily because my mother was already craning her neck, camera raised, not toward the stage where my name would be called, but toward my brother in the stands, laughing with friends. And when I later asked why they hadn't taken a single photo of me in my cap and gown, she laughed it off and said, "You don't need pictures to know you did well," as if validation were a childish craving I should have outgrown. And when my brother graduated a few years later, after barely scraping by, the house filled with balloons, relatives flew in from out of state, and my parents organized a dinner that mirrored, almost mockingly, the same kind of public celebration I'd learned not to expect. Those memories resurfaced now not as isolated disappointments but as a pattern so consistent it felt intentional. And the cottage was simply the most tangible expression of it. Because unlike praise or attention, property was something that could be measured, transferred, taken, and my family treated it the same way they treated everything else I had ever been given, as temporary, conditional, and subject to redistribution if someone else wanted it more. My husband, who had never fully understood the dynamics because he'd grown up in a household where fairness wasn't a debate but an assumption, tried to intervene gently at first, suggesting we clarify the legal ownership, reminding me that the cottage had been transferred to us directly by his parents, that there was paperwork, that my parents didn't actually have the authority they were assuming. But even that felt dangerous to me because in my family, facts had always mattered less than feelings, and my mother's feelings in particular carried the weight of law, and I knew from experience that pointing out technicalities would be framed as aggression, greed, or ingratitude. When I did finally mention, during a family visit a few weeks later, that the cottage wasn't theirs to give away, my mother's expression hardened instantly, and she accused me of being dramatic, of misunderstanding her intent, of twisting a generous plan into something ugly, and my father chimed in with his familiar refrain about not rocking the boat, urging me to be flexible, to think about my brother's future, to remember that things work out differently for different people, which was another way of saying that fairness was negotiable and my losses were acceptable collateral. My brother, meanwhile, began speaking about the cottage as if it were already his, casually mentioning renovations he'd like to make, joking about finally having a place to host holidays, and each comment landed like a small theft, not because I was powerless to stop it but because I had been trained to doubt my right to object, to question whether asserting myself would make me selfish or cruel, and that internal conflict was as exhausting as it was familiar, a constant negotiation between what I knew to be true and what I'd been conditioned to accept. There were moments when I considered cutting contact entirely, pulling away from the family narrative and protecting myself through distance, but even that felt like a failure of endurance, as if walking away would prove them right about my fragility, and so I stayed engaged, answering calls, attending dinners, listening as my mother reframed the situation again and again until it sounded almost reasonable, telling relatives that I had agreed to the arrangement, that I was supportive, that I understood my brother's needs, and each retelling erased me a little more, turning my silence into consent. What no one noticed, or perhaps no one cared to notice, was that I had stopped arguing not because I agreed but because I was paying attention in a different way now, noticing how quickly decisions were made when they favored my brother, how paperwork appeared when it benefited him, how resources were mobilized with urgency when his comfort was at stake, and how often I was expected to adapt quietly in the background, and while on the surface it may have looked like I was retreating, accepting my place, the truth was that something in me had shifted from seeking approval to seeking clarity, and I began, slowly and without announcement, to gather information, not out of spite or revenge but out of a need to ground myself in something solid, because after years of having my reality questioned, reframed, and overwritten, I needed facts that couldn't be smiled away. And as I sat through another family dinner where plans were discussed without my input and jokes were made at my expense in the name of closeness, I realized that the injustice I felt wasn't just emotional but structural, built into the way my family distributed power, trust, and benefit, and that if I wanted anything to change, it wouldn't come from pleading for fairness but from understanding exactly where the lines were drawn and who had actually drawn them. By the time spring arrived, the conversations about the cottage had stopped including me altogether, which on the surface felt like relief but underneath carried a quieter kind of erasure, because decisions were still being made, just without the pretense of my consent, and I would hear about them secondhand through my father or catch fragments during phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. And this exclusion mirrored so many earlier moments in my life that it almost felt rehearsed, like when I'd found out my parents had co-signed a loan for my brother's business venture after it failed the first time, a detail they'd neglected to mention while lecturing me about financial responsibility and independence, or when I learned through a cousin that my brother had been given money for a down payment years earlier while I was praised for saving on my own, as if struggle were a character-building exercise reserved just for me. The pattern wasn't just favoritism but a consistent imbalance of power disguised as pragmatism, where my reliability was leveraged to justify my deprivation, and that realization settled into me with an uncomfortable clarity, forcing me to confront the possibility that my family's behavior wasn't thoughtless or reactive but strategic in its own way, built on the assumption that I would absorb whatever was asked of me because I always had. During this period, my husband's parents visited, and while the cottage came up only briefly in conversation, their confusion was immediate and unfeigned when I mentioned carefully that my family was talking about transferring it to my brother, because from their perspective, the property had been a gift to us, a gesture of trust and love meant to support our marriage, not an asset to be redistributed through my family's internal politics, and their surprise was the first external confirmation I'd had that I wasn't overreacting, that this wasn't a gray area or a misunderstanding but a clear overreach, and while they reassured me that the legal ownership was secure, that the paperwork was clear and final, I found that reassurance didn't bring the peace I expected, because the issue had grown beyond legality into something more personal, a test of whether I would continue to allow my family to define my boundaries or finally assert them. Around the same time, my brother announced, with great enthusiasm and very little planning, that he intended to move into the cottage by the end of summer, speaking as though timelines and permissions were mere formalities, and my mother echoed this optimism, already talking about paint colors and furniture, framing the transition as something exciting and inevitable, and when I hesitated, she accused me of being negative, of dragging my feet, of making things difficult when everyone else was trying to move forward, a familiar reversal where my discomfort was cast as obstruction. What they didn't see, or again chose not to see, was that I had begun to quietly detach emotionally, not in a dramatic way but in small, deliberate steps, observing rather than reacting, listening without immediately internalizing, and this shift gave me the space to notice details I'd previously missed, like how my father deferred to my mother not out of agreement but habit, how my brother's confidence was propped up by constant reinforcement, and how my own self-doubt had been cultivated through years of subtle dismissal. I started documenting conversations, saving messages where plans were discussed, noting dates and phrasing, not because I planned to confront them immediately but because I needed to anchor my experience in something tangible, something that couldn't be dismissed as emotional interpretation, and this act, simple as it was, felt oddly empowering, like reclaiming a narrative that had always been edited without my input. Meanwhile, family gatherings continued as usual, and I attended them with the same outward composure I'd always maintained, laughing at the appropriate moments, offering help in the kitchen, listening as my mother recounted stories that subtly minimized my role while elevating my brothers, and each time I felt a growing distance, not coldness but clarity, a sense that I was no longer seeking their approval but studying the dynamics at play, understanding how power moved through the room and where it settled. There was a particularly telling moment at a cousin's graduation party when my mother, in front of extended family, praised my brother's resilience in the face of setbacks and contrasted it with my natural ability, implying that his struggles were more deserving of support because they were hard-won, while mine were effortless and therefore less valuable, and as relatives nodded along, I felt that old sting of invisibility, but it was muted now, replaced by a steadier resolve, because I could see the narrative being constructed in real time, and I knew that as long as I remained silent, it would stand uncontested. Yet even as I gathered information and awareness, I was careful not to reveal this shift, because I understood instinctively that any sign of resistance would be met not with dialogue but with escalation, with emotional pressure designed to push me back into compliance, And so I continued to play my role, the accommodating daughter, the supportive sister, all while building a private understanding of my situation that would later become something more than awareness, something that would allow me, when the time was right, to step out of the frame my family had built for me and into a position they hadn't anticipated, one grounded, not in anger or confrontation but in undeniable fact and a calm refusal to be erased any longer. The summer that followed unfolded with an unsettling sense of inevitability, as if my family were moving along a script they'd rehearsed for years, confident that I would continue to play my part without deviation, and while on the surface my life appeared unchanged, inside I was experiencing a quiet recalibration that altered how I moved through every interaction with them, because the more I observed, the clearer it became that their certainty was built not on entitlement alone but on a deep belief in my compliance, a belief I had spent a lifetime reinforcing by choosing peace over truth, harmony over self-respect. During those months my brother's plans grew louder and more detailed, and my mother spoke about the cottage with an authority that bordered on ownership, telling neighbors and relatives that it would soon be back in the family, as if it had only ever been on loan to me, and each time I heard that phrase, something tightened in my chest, not just because it erased the generosity of my husband's parents but because it rewrote my marriage as an extension of my family rather than a boundary from it, and I realized how little my independence had ever been acknowledged, how often my adulthood was treated as conditional, valid only so long as it aligned with their expectations. There were moments when the pressure intensified, especially when practical obstacles arose, like questions about insurance, utilities, or access, and instead of addressing those questions themselves, my parents turned to me for solutions, assuming I would smooth over details that contradicted their assumptions, and when I hesitated, even briefly, the emotional weight descended quickly, my mother's disappointment expressed through sighs and pointed comments about how complicated I was making things, my father's reminders that families didn't need everything in writing, that trust should be enough, and my brother's impatience thinly veiled as humor, all combining into a familiar chorus designed to wear me down. What surprised me was not that they applied this pressure but that it no longer worked the way it once had, because instead of feeling guilty, I felt detached as though I were watching a dynamic I'd finally outgrown, and this detachment allowed me to recognize how carefully my mother managed perception, presenting herself as reasonable and generous while framing any resistance as selfishness, a tactic that had kept me silent for years but now felt transparent, almost predictable. During this time I found myself reflecting on earlier turning points I dismissed as isolated incidents, like the year I graduated college and my parents chose not to attend the ceremony because my brother had a minor scheduling conflict, promising to celebrate later and never following through, or the time I declined a financial gift, because it came with conditions I wasn't willing to accept, only to be labeled ungrateful for prioritizing autonomy over assistance. And these memories, revisited through the lens of my current situation, formed a cohesive narrative of control masked as care, of support offered only when it reinforced dependence. As the weeks passed, I began to feel a subtle shift in my own confidence, not the loud kind that announces itself but a steadier presence rooted in self-trust. And this shift was reinforced by small, deliberate actions, like consulting a lawyer under the guise of general estate questions, organizing documents related to the cottage and my marriage, and having quiet conversations with my husband about boundaries we'd need to enforce together, none of which I shared with my family, not because I was hiding something illicit but because I had learned that transparency with people who weaponize information is not honesty but vulnerability. Meanwhile, family gatherings took on an almost surreal quality, with my mother speaking enthusiastically about future holidays at the cottage, assigning rooms, imagining traditions, and I would nod politely while feeling a growing sense of distance, as though the version of me they were addressing no longer existed. And in those moments I understood that the power imbalance I'd lived under wasn't maintained through force but through narrative, through the story they told about who I was and what I would tolerate, and that story was beginning to crack, not because I challenged it openly but because I no longer believed it myself. There was a particular afternoon when my mother called to ask for copies of the keys, saying it would be easier for my brother to start bringing things up on weekends, and the casualness of the request, the assumption embedded in it, struck me with a clarity that felt almost physical, because it encapsulated everything I'd been grappling with, the expectation of access, the dismissal of consent, the certainty that my resources were communal while theirs remained private. And as I listened to her speak, I realized that any direct refusal at that moment would trigger a confrontation I wasn't yet ready to have. Not because I feared it, but because I understood the importance of timing, of allowing the pattern to fully reveal itself before I stepped out of it. So I responded calmly, non-committally, buying time while internally solidifying a resolve that no longer wavered. And when I hung up the phone, I didn't feel shaken or upset, just focused, because for the first time I wasn't reacting to their actions but preparing for my own, recognizing that the justice I needed wouldn't come from their acknowledgement or apology, but from a decisive moment where the narrative they relied on would collapse under the weight of reality they could no longer ignore. By early fall, the situation had reached a strange kind of equilibrium, one where my family operated under the assumption that their plans were proceeding smoothly while I moved quietly beneath the surface, no longer trying to correct them but no longer surrendering pieces of myself either. And this duality required a level of emotional discipline I hadn't known I possessed, because it meant sitting through conversations that assumed outcomes I knew were not guaranteed, listening to my mother describe renovations that would never happen and timelines that were built on consent she did not have, all while maintaining an outward calm that concealed a growing sense of internal authority. During this period, my husband and I began spending more time at the cottage ourselves, not in a dramatic show of ownership but in a deliberate effort to reconnect with the space as something that belonged to our present, not our past or our extended family. And being there grounded me in a way I hadn't anticipated, because every creaking floorboard and quiet morning reinforced the truth that this place had been given to us as a gesture of trust, not as a bargaining chip, and that remembering its origin mattered as much as protecting its future. Meanwhile, my brother's confidence escalated into entitlement, and he began telling people openly that he would be moving in any day now, a claim that reached me through acquaintances who assumed I was aware and supportive. And each time I heard it, I felt a flicker of anger that quickly settled into resolve, because the more public the assumption became, the clearer the eventual correction would need to be. And I understood that when the truth emerged, it would not be quiet or easily dismissed. Behind the scenes, I continued to prepare, gathering documentation, clarifying legal boundaries, and most importantly, recalibrating my emotional responses, practicing restraint in moments where I would once have explained myself, defended my feelings, or sought validation, because I had learned through painful repetition that justification only invited negotiation, and I was no longer willing to negotiate my right to be respected. This shift was tested repeatedly, especially during a family gathering held ostensibly to celebrate my brother's birthday, where my mother, in front of a room full of relatives, thanked me for being so understanding about the cottage, framing my silence as agreement and my endurance as generosity. And as the room filled with approving murmurs, I felt that familiar pressure to smile and play along, but this time, instead of shrinking, I felt something settle into place, a recognition that their narrative required my participation to survive, and that every unchallenged assumption was building toward a moment when the truth would be unavoidable. Later that evening, my father pulled me aside and suggested, in a tone meant to sound reasonable, that it might be simpler if we formalized the transfer sooner rather than later, implying that delays only created confusion. And I listened without interrupting, noting how quickly the responsibility for clarity was placed on me rather than on those making the demands. And when he finished, I responded with a neutral acknowledgement that neither confirmed nor denied anything, a small but significant departure from my old pattern of immediate reassurance. The real turning point came not through confrontation but through observation, when I noticed how my brother reacted to minor obstacles, like scheduling conflicts or financial questions, with frustration and impatience, revealing how deeply he believed the outcome was guaranteed. And I realized that this belief, nurtured by my parents and unchallenged by me, was the fragile foundation on which everything rested, and that when it finally gave way, the collapse would be swift and disorienting for them. As fall deepened, my mother's calls became more frequent and more insistent, peppered with comments about fairness and family unity that were clearly designed to preempt resistance. And while I continued to respond politely, I stopped offering explanations, a change she seemed to sense even if she couldn't name it, because her tone shifted, becoming sharper, more urgent, as if she were trying to reassert control before it slipped entirely. Through all of this, I remained focused on a single principle that had emerged from months of reflection, that justice did not require me to be loud or confrontational, only precise and unwavering, and that when the moment came, it would not be fueled by anger or resentment but by the calm certainty of someone who had finally decided to stop negotiating their own worth. and as I watched the leaves change around the cottage and felt the weight of my family's expectations pressing down, I knew that the balance they relied on was already tilting, not because I had pushed it, but because I had stepped out of the position that had kept it stable for so long. The illusion finally began to strain in ways my family could no longer smooth over when logistics demanded action instead of assumptions, because planning and ownership are easy to blur in conversation but impossible to fake when keys, access, and authority become necessary. And it was during this phase that the emotional pressure escalated into something sharper, more desperate, as my mother realized that her confidence alone was no longer enough to move things forward. She started calling, with a sense of urgency she hadn't used before, asking pointed questions about when we planned to wrap things up, hinting at deadlines my brother was facing, and framing every delay as a problem I was creating rather than a boundary I was enforcing. And each call followed the same pattern, beginning with warmth, slipping into concern, and ending with thinly veiled frustration when I refused to provide the assurances she wanted. And while this might once have unsettled me, now it simply confirmed what I already understood, that their certainty depended on my cooperation, and without it, the structure they'd built began to wobble. My brother, too, became more openly impatient, reaching out directly instead of through my parents, speaking with a familiarity that assumed consent and an irritation that surfaced whenever I didn't immediately accommodate his requests. And this shift revealed something important, because it showed how deeply he believed access to my life and resources was his by default, a belief reinforced by years of unchallenged favoritism. And watching that belief surface in his tone, in the way he spoke to me not as a sister but as an obstacle, clarified the power imbalance more starkly than any memory ever had. There was a particular conversation that crystallized this for me, when he casually mentioned plans to bring contractors up to the cottage and asked which weekends worked best for us to stay out of the way. And the assumption embedded in that phrase landed with a quiet force, because it reduced my presence to an inconvenience, my ownership to a technicality, and for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to soften my response or cushion his expectations, instead answering calmly that no such plans had been approved and that any decisions about the property would involve us directly, a statement so measured and factual that it left him momentarily silent. And in that silence, I sensed the first crack in the narrative they'd all been relying on. Predictably, the fallout came quickly, with my mother calling later that day, her tone tight and controlled, accusing me of blindsiding my brother, of creating unnecessary tension, of forgetting how much the family had done for me. And as she spoke, cycling through guilt, obligation, and revisionist history, I felt a strange sense of detachment, not coldness but clarity, because I could hear the strategy in her words, the attempt to reassert authority by invoking sacrifice and loyalty, and for the first time it didn't hook into anything inside me, it simply passed through. I responded briefly, reiterating that the cottage was not a communal asset and that any discussions about its use would be handled by my husband and me, and the firmness of that boundary, expressed without apology or explanation, marked a turning point, because it removed the emotional leverage she'd relied on for years. And her reaction, a sharp intake of breath followed by a strained silence, told me she felt it too. From that moment on, the dynamics shifted noticeably, with my parents alternating between attempts to reason with me and subtle threats of estrangement, warning that my stance could damage relationships, that people would be hurt, that I would regret being inflexible. And while these warnings might once have sent me scrambling to repair the breach, now they only underscored how conditional their acceptance had always been, how quickly warmth turned to pressure when compliance was no longer guaranteed. Extended family began to weigh in as well, reaching out with carefully worded messages that echoed my mother's talking points, suggesting compromise, reminding me of tradition, and framing the situation as a misunderstanding rather than a clear overstep. And each message served as further evidence of how effectively the narrative had been disseminated, how my silence had allowed assumptions to harden into collective belief. And yet, instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt anchored, because I had facts, documentation, and a growing sense of moral authority that no amount of persuasion could erode. Behind all of this, the quiet preparation I'd undertaken reached its final stages, not in the form of a dramatic reveal but through a steady consolidation of control, ensuring that when the inevitable confrontation occurred, it would not hinge on emotion or interpretation but on reality. And as the pressure intensified and the tone of every interaction sharpened, I understood that the moment of reversal was no longer hypothetical. It was approaching, carried forward not by my desire for vindication but by the simple truth that the structure my family had built could not stand without my silence, and I had finally withdrawn it. Embedded in that phrase landed with a quiet force, because it reduced my presence to an inconvenience, my ownership to a technicality, and for the first time, I didn't feel compelled to soften my response or cushion his expectations, instead answering calmly that no such plans had been approved and that any decisions about the property would involve us directly, a statement so measured and factual that it left him momentarily silent, and in that silence I sensed the first crack in the narrative they'd all been relying on. Predictably, the fallout came quickly, with my mother calling later that day, her tone tight and controlled, accusing me of blindsiding my brother, of creating unnecessary tension, of forgetting how much the family had done for me, and as she spoke, cycling through guilt, obligation, and revisionist history, I felt a strange sense of detachment, not coldness but clarity, because I could hear the strategy in her words, the attempt to reassert authority by invoking sacrifice and loyalty, and for the first time it didn't hook into anything inside me, it simply passed through. I responded briefly, reiterating that the cottage was not a communal asset and that any discussions about its use would be handled by my husband and me, and the firmness of that boundary, expressed without apology or explanation, marked a turning point, because it removed the emotional leverage she'd relied on for years, and her reaction, a sharp intake of breath followed by a strained silence, told me she felt it too. From that moment on, the dynamics shifted noticeably, with my parents alternating between attempts to reason with me and subtle threats of estrangement, warning that my stance could damage relationships, that people would be hurt, that I would regret being inflexible, and while these warnings might once have sent me scrambling to repair the breach, now they only underscored how conditional their acceptance had always been, how quickly warmth turned to pressure when compliance was no longer guaranteed. Extended family began to weigh in as well, reaching out with carefully worded messages that echoed my mother's talking points, suggesting compromise, reminding me of tradition, and framing the situation as a misunderstanding rather than a clear overstep, and each message served as further evidence of how effectively the narrative had been disseminated, how my silence had allowed assumptions to harden into collective belief, and yet, instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt anchored because I had facts, documentation, and a growing sense of moral authority that no amount of persuasion could erode. Behind all of this, the quiet preparation I'd undertaken reached its final stages, not in the form of a dramatic reveal but through a steady consolidation of control, ensuring that when the inevitable confrontation occurred, it would not hinge on emotion or interpretation but on reality, and as the pressure intensified and the tone of every interaction sharpened, I understood that the moment of reversal was no longer hypothetical, it was approaching, carried forward not by my desire for vindication but by the simple truth that the structure my family had built could not stand without my silence, and I had finally withdrawn it. The confrontation didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors the way I once imagined it might, but with a family gathering that had been planned weeks in advance, a weekend dinner at my parents' house meant to finalize holiday arrangements, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, I could already sense the weight of expectation hanging in the air, because this wasn't just about food or schedules but about forcing resolution on terms that favored them, and as I stepped inside I saw immediately that the audience had been carefully selected, my brother there with his girlfriend, my parents seated at the table, and a few extended relatives positioned in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like reinforcement, and in that moment, I understood that this was meant to be decisive, a setting designed to apply collective pressure and secure compliance. Dinner unfolded with strained politeness at first, small talk stretched thin over an undercurrent of tension, until my mother finally steered the conversation where she wanted it, bringing up the cottage as if it were a logistical detail left unresolved rather than the center of months of conflict, and she spoke with the same calm authority she'd used at the restaurant months earlier, outlining plans and expectations as though agreement were already in place, and as she talked, I noticed how everyone's attention shifted subtly toward me, waiting for the familiar nod, the quiet acceptance that would validate the story they'd been telling each other. Instead of responding immediately, I took a moment to observe the scene, my brother's confident posture, my father's cautious expression, the relatives' expectant faces, and I felt a surprising sense of calm, not because the moment was easy but because it was clear, and clarity has a way of cutting through fear. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady and measured, and I stated simply that there had been a misunderstanding, that the cottage was not available for transfer or use by anyone else, and that any assumptions to the contrary were incorrect, and the simplicity of that statement, devoid of accusation or emotion, landed heavily, because it left no room for negotiation or reinterpretation. The reaction was immediate and telling, my brother's face shifting from confidence to confusion, then to disbelief, my mother stiffening as if bracing against an unexpected impact, and my father glancing between us as though trying to assess whether this was a bluff or a mistake, and as questions began to surface, overlapping and urgent, I maintained the same calm, repeating the facts without embellishment, explaining that the property had been gifted to my husband and me, that there was no agreement to transfer it, and that access had never been authorized, and each repetition chipped away at the narrative they'd constructed, exposing how much it had relied on assumption rather than consent. My mother attempted to reassert control, reframing the issue as a family matter that shouldn't be reduced to paperwork, accusing me of prioritizing technicalities over relationships, and for a brief moment, I saw the old dynamic flicker back to life, the familiar attempt to shift the focus from boundaries to guilt, but this time it found no purchase, because I responded not by defending myself but by restating my position, making it clear that respect for boundaries was foundational to any relationship worth maintaining. The room grew quiet in a way that felt almost reverent, as if everyone were realizing simultaneously that the ground had shifted beneath them, and in that silence, the truth became unavoidable, that the power they'd exercised for years had depended on my acquiescence, and without it, they were left confronting a reality they had not prepared for. My brother, visibly shaken, protested that he'd already made plans, that promises had been made, and when I replied that those promises had not been mine to give, the weight of responsibility settled uncomfortably where it belonged, and for the first time, I saw him not as the favored son but as someone forced to reckon with the consequences of entitlement, and my parents, faced with the collapse of their narrative in front of witnesses, could no longer smooth things over or delay the reckoning, and as the evening drew to a close in a haze of unfinished food and unspoken tension, I left knowing that while the outcome had not yet fully crystallized, the reversal had begun. Not with drama or spectacle but with a quiet assertion of truth that could not be undone. In the weeks that followed that dinner, the noise slowly drained out of my life in a way that felt unfamiliar but deeply peaceful, because once the truth had been spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses, my family no longer had the luxury of pretending this was a misunderstanding or a temporary disagreement, and the frantic calls, emotional appeals, and strategic silences that came afterward only confirmed what I had already accepted, that the relationship I'd been trying to preserve for years had always depended on how much of myself I was willing to give up, and now that I wasn't, the imbalance was impossible to ignore. My parents oscillated between indignation and hurt, framing my decision as betrayal, as ingratitude, as evidence that I'd changed in ways they didn't recognize, and in a sense they were right because I had changed not into someone cruel or selfish, but into someone who no longer confused endurance with virtue. And when my mother finally admitted, during a strained phone call, that she hadn't expected me to stand firm, that admission landed harder than any accusation ever had, because it revealed how deeply my silence had been mistaken for consent all these years. My brother withdrew almost entirely, his confidence replaced by a resentment he didn't know how to process, and while part of me felt a familiar pull toward guilt, toward smoothing things over and making it easier for everyone else, that pull no longer dictated my actions because I could see clearly now that repairing the discomfort caused by boundaries would only restore the conditions that made them necessary in the first place. Instead, I focused on my own life, on my marriage, on the quiet stability that came from no longer anticipating the next emotional demand, and the cottage, once a source of tension and projection, became what it was always meant to be, a place of rest, reflection, and reclaimed autonomy, where mornings were slow and decisions were made collaboratively, not announced over dinner tables or passed down as obligations. Over time, extended family began to understand the situation more accurately, as inconsistencies in my parents' story surfaced and the absence of my brother's promised move became conspicuous, and while no one offered formal apologies, the shift in tone was unmistakable, a subtle acknowledgement that the narrative they'd been given hadn't held up under scrutiny, and that quiet validation, though never explicit, was enough. The greatest resolution, however, didn't come from external recognition but from an internal stillness I hadn't known before, the relief of no longer rehearsing conversations in my head, no longer bracing myself for disappointment at every gathering, no longer measuring my worth by how much discomfort I could absorb for the sake of family unity. And in that space I found clarity, understanding that delayed justice doesn't always arrive with triumph or reconciliation but sometimes with distance, self-trust, and the quiet confidence of knowing you acted with integrity. My parents and I still speak, though carefully, and the relationship exists now on different terms, defined by clear limits rather than unspoken expectations, and while it isn't the closeness I once hoped for, it is honest in a way it never was before, because it no longer asks me to disappear to keep the peace. Looking back, I see that the dinner where my mother smiled and tried to give away something that wasn't hers wasn't the moment I lost something but the moment I stopped losing myself. And the justice that followed wasn't loud or vindictive but steady and complete, leaving me grounded in a life that finally feels like my own. Friends, if you liked our story, then be sure to like and comment on the video. And to watch such story videos, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so that you will receive our new content every day.